I was choosing nursery paint when a phone notification shattered my life. It was a request to confirm a digital signature for a massive mortgage on the penthouse I had owned for years. My husband thought he could leverage my home to fund his escape with his office mistress, but he forgot he was stealing from a professional risk assessor. When I sign that final paper, he is the one who will lose everything. My name is Morgan, and at 32 years old, I prided myself on my ability to calculate risk. As a professional property valuation expert, my entire career was built on spotting the cracks in a foundation before the building ever collapsed. I lived my life by spreadsheets and actuarial tables, finding comfort in the predictable nature of numbers. But as I stood in the center of the nursery in my Chicago penthouse, rubbing a protective hand over the swell of my 7-month pregnant belly, I realized I had missed the most dangerous fracture of all. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and windy outside, the kind of weather that made the warmth of my home feel like a fortress. That illusion shattered with a single vibration from my phone resting on the windowsill. I picked it up, expecting a message from my obstetrician or maybe a delivery update for the crib. Instead, the screen displayed a high-priority security alert from my bank. The message was terse and terrifying. It requested that I confirm a digital signature for a pending mortgage application on my apartment. I frowned, the skin between my eyebrows pinching together. I owned this penthouse outright, an inheritance from my grandmother that predated my marriage to Grant by 5 years. There was no mortgage. There was never supposed to be a mortgage. My fingers felt thick and clumsy as I dialed Grant's number. He was 34 years old, the director of sales at Stratton and Oak, and usually he picked up for me on the first ring. Today, the call went straight to voicemail after 2 rings, followed instantly by a generic text message that read, "In a critical meeting. Call you call back later." Panic began to rise in my chest, hot and suffocating, but my professional instincts kicked in before the emotion could take over. Panic was a liability. Data was an asset. I sat down heavily on the velvet ottoman and logged into the bank's secure portal. The interface loaded agonizingly slowly. When the document finally popped up, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a loan application for $750,000, secured against my home. At the bottom of the page was a scan of a signature. It was a good copy, but it was not mine. The loop on the M was too wide, and the slant was slightly too aggressive. I knew that hand. I had seen it on our marriage license. I had seen it on birthday cards. It was Grant's hand trying to be mine. A wave of nausea hit me that had nothing to do with the baby. Grant was the only other person who knew the combination to the wall safe where the deed was kept. He was the only one who could have scanned the original to create this forgery. I needed to know where he was, and I needed to know now. I dialed the main line at Stratton and Oak. The receptionist, a sweet girl named Brenda who liked to overshare, answered on the second ring. I kept my voice steady, masking the tremor that was starting to shake my knees. "Hi, Brenda. It is Morgan. I need to get a quick file to Grant, but he is not answering his cell. Is he still in the conference room?" "Oh, hi, Morgan," Brenda chirped, oblivious to the world collapsing around me. No, Grant actually left around noon. He went out for a site survey with Ms. Sloan. They said they would be gone for the rest of the day. The name Sloan hit me like a physical blow. Sloan was the new marketing associate, the one Grant laughed about over dinner, calling her a walking decoration who did not know a spreadsheet from a lunch menu. But suddenly, the late nights at the office, the sudden need to change his phone password 2 weeks ago, and the new shirts he had bought for client meetings all fell into a sickening pattern. The joke was on me. Did he say which site? "Brenda," I asked, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. "Let me check the log," she said, humming a little tune. Here it is. They went to do a review at the Aveline Hotel. The Aveline. It was not a construction site or a new development. It was a luxury boutique hotel downtown, famous for its discretion and its silk sheets. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. My heart was hammering against my ribs. a frantic rhythm that the baby seemed to sense, shifting uncomfortably inside me. I grabbed my car keys and my purse. The valet at the Avaline recognized my car immediately, a perk of the many client meetings I had hosted here over the years. I waved off his offer to park the vehicle and drove straight to the VIP lot around the back, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The first piece of evidence was waiting for me in spot number 4. Grant's sensible gray sedan was parked there, but it was not alone. Right next to it, aggressively close, was a flashy red sports car that screamed for attention. It was the kind of car a woman like Sloane would drive. Seeing them side by side, bumper to bumper, felt like a physical slap to the face. I did not storm the front entrance. I did not call his phone again. Instead, I retrieved my heavy black membership card from my wallet and entered through the private side door that led directly to the executive lounge. This was a space reserved for high-level negotiations and quiet affairs, dimly lit and smelling of old books and expensive scotch. I moved silently across the plush carpet, my breath shallow in my throat. The lounge was mostly empty at 2 in the afternoon, which made spotting them easy. They were seated in a secluded booth near the back window. I slipped behind a large, ornamental fiddle-leaf fig tree, using the dense foliage as a shield. From my vantage point, I could see everything. Grant was leaning back in the leather booth, his tie loosened, looking relaxed in a way he never was at home anymore. Sloane was next to him, and she was every bit the stunning distraction he had joked about. She had glossy dark hair and a sharp, predatory beauty, but it was her hands that held my attention. She was running her manicured fingers up and down Grant's forearm, a gesture so possessive and intimate that it erased any possibility of this being a work meeting. I pulled my phone from my purse. My hands were shaking, but I forced them to be steady. I opened a high-fidelity audio recording app I used for dictating site notes and activated the directional microphone setting. I pointed the bottom of the phone toward their booth and watched the sound waves spike on the screen as their voices became clear through my earbuds. "You worry too much, baby," Grant was saying, his voice oozing a confidence that made my stomach turn. "The bank already pre-approved the structure. Once the funds hit the account, we transfer them to the shell company for the project." And the wife, Sloane's voice was lower, husky and mocking. "You are sure she will not catch on? That condo is her baby." "Morgan," Grant let out a dismissive laugh that cut deeper than a knife. "Please, she is so hormonal right now she can barely decide what to eat for dinner, let alone read the fine print. I told her the papers are just a new insurance policy for the kid. She will sign whatever I put in front of her if I say it protects the family." "Good," Sloane purred, leaning in to kiss his cheek. "Because once we liquidate that place, we are going to have enough cash to disappear before the first payment is even due." I froze. The coldness in my veins turned to ice. This was not just an affair. This was a heist. They were not just sleeping together. They were plotting to dismantle my life, sell the roof over my unborn child's head, and vanish with the proceeds. They were treating me like a fool, a walking incubator with a bank account to be drained. A sharp, cramping pain seized my abdomen. I gasped softly, my hand flying to my stomach. It was not the baby. It was the sheer, toxic force of disgust. The man I had shared a bed with, the man whose child I was carrying, was sitting 20 feet away, laughing about making me homeless. I stared at the waveform on my phone screen, watching the jagged lines of their betrayal being etched into digital memory. I was not just a wife anymore. I was a witness to a crime, and I had the recording to prove it. I slipped out of the lounge as silently as I had entered, leaving the two conspirators to their drinks and their delusions. I made it to my car, locked the doors, and allowed myself to break down. For exactly 5 minutes, I sobbed, gripping the steering wheel until my hands ached, mourning the death of the marriage I thought I had. But at the 6-minute mark, I reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a pack of wet wipes, and cleaned my face. The tears were done. The mourning period was over. Now, it was time for the audit. As I stared at the dashboard, a crucial detail from the company Christmas party 2 years ago clicked into place. Sloane was not just some random office hire. She was married to Richard. I remembered him distinctly, an older, imposing man who Grant always spoke about with a mixture of reverence and fear. Richard was a silent partner at Stratton and Oak, one of the primary investors who kept the lights on. The realization made me let out a short, cold laugh. Grant was not just sleeping with a coworker, he was sleeping with the wife of the man who held the keys to his entire career. It was reckless, it was stupid, and it was the leverage I needed to bury him. I drove home with a dry face and a clear mind. Grant was still at the hotel, likely celebrating his brilliance, which gave me a window of opportunity. When I entered our apartment, the silence felt heavy, but I did not stop to dwell on it. I went straight to Grant's home office. I knew his habits better than he knew himself. He was lazy with digital security, but he was paranoid about physical paper trails. I started with the bookshelf behind his mahogany desk. He always hid things behind the rows of dusty business biographies he never read. Sure enough, behind a thick volume on the history of the stock market, I found a manila folder. I opened it, and the contents confirmed everything I had heard in the hotel lounge. But seeing it in black and white was sickening. It was a roadmap to ruin. There were draft documents for a fast cash mortgage on my penthouse, followed by a timeline for declaring personal bankruptcy to stall the bank while the funds were siphoned off to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. But the real revelation came when I picked up his iPad, which was sitting on the desk charging. It was synced to his phone. I scrolled through the message thread with Sloane work. It was a catalog of filth and manipulation. I snapped photos of everything with my phone. The texts revealed that Sloane was the architect of this entire scheme. I cannot leave Richard until we have the money. Grant. One message read, "He made me sign a prenup. If I walk away now, I get 0. We need your wife's equity to start over." Grant had replied, "Don't worry. The cow is too big and tired to notice anything. I will have the cash by Friday." I stared at the word cow. That was what he called the mother of his child. I took a photo of that message twice, just to be sure. 2 hours later, I heard the front door open. I was sitting on the living room sofa, reading a parenting magazine, looking for all the world like the oblivious housewife he thought I was. Grant walked in, and the scent of the Aveline's signature bergamot soap clung to him, mixed with a cheap, cloying perfume that was definitely not mine. He was holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations. He bent down to kiss my forehead, and I had to use every ounce of my willpower not to recoil. "Sorry I am late. Meetings ran long. How is the little guy doing?" He patted my belly. I forced a tired smile. "He is kicking," I said softly. "I have just been so exhausted today. Pregnancy brain. You know." Grant's eyes lit up. He saw the weakness he was banking on. He sat down next to me, still holding the cheap flowers. "I know. Babe, listen, about those insurance papers for the baby's trust. I really need to get those filed. Can we look at them tonight?" I yawned, feigning a deep fatigue. "Oh, Grant, my head is pounding. I do not think I can read legal jargon right now. Can we do it tomorrow night? Maybe make a nice dinner of it. I want to celebrate getting everything settled." He hesitated, a flash of impatience crossing his face, but he quickly smoothed it over. "Of course. Tomorrow is perfect. Just you, me, and our future." "Actually," I said, dropping the first crumb of my trap, "I was thinking we should make it a real celebration. Invite some friends. Maybe even some of your work colleagues. I feel like I have been such a hermit lately." He smiled, thinking he had won. He had no idea that he had just agreed to his own execution. "Whatever makes you happy, Morgan." Dinner that evening was an exercise in suffocation. The air in the dining room felt heavy, charged with the static of unspoken lies. Grant had barely touched his roast chicken, his eyes darting repeatedly to the manila envelope he had placed conspicuously at the center of the table, right between the salt and pepper shakers. Every time I took a sip of water, he watched me, waiting for the moment my guard would drop. "It is just standard asset restructuring. Morgan," he said for the third time, pushing a piece of broccoli around his plate with agitated, jerky movements. "I told you, with the baby coming, we need to be liquid. This power of attorney just lets me handle the boring administrative stuff while you focus on resting. You do not want to be running to the bank every other day when you are 8 months pregnant. Do you?" I looked at him, widening my eyes in a performance of naive trust that would have won me an award. "Of course not, honey. You are so thoughtful to handle all the stress for us." I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable before I dropped my fork with a loud clatter. "But you know, this feels like such a big step, restructuring our entire future. It deserves more than just a quick signature over leftover chicken." Grant blinked, confused. "What do you mean, I want to make it official?" I said, beaming at him. "A little signing ceremony. Tomorrow night. Here." "A ceremony," Grant laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Morgan, it is just paperwork. We can sign it right now and be done with it." "No," I insisted, crossing my arms over my chest. "My father always said important business should be done in the light. I want witnesses. I was thinking we should invite your partner, you know, to show them how committed we are to the company's future." Grant went pale. "My partner?" "Yes, invite Sloane," I said brightly. "She has been helping you so much lately with those late nights at the office. We should thank her, and we should invite her husband, Richard, too, after all. If this investment is as good as you say, Richard should be there to toast to it." "Right." Grant choked on his water. He grabbed his napkin, coughing violently. "Richard Morgan. Richard is incredibly busy. He does not have time for a dinner party at our place. And Sloane. I do not think—" I let my smile fade, replacing it with a look of hurt confusion. "Oh, I see. You do not want Richard to see the papers. Is there something wrong with the deal?" "Grant, because if you are not confident enough to sign this in front of your boss, then I certainly am not confident enough to sign it at all." If he agreed, he risked exposure, but his arrogance kicked in. I could see him calculating, convincing himself that he could charm his way through one dinner, that he and Sloane were smart enough to play the part of strangers in front of Richard and me. "Fine," he said, exhaling sharply. "If it means that much to you, I will ask them, but we keep it brief." "Perfect," I chirped. "I will handle the catering." The moment Grant retreated to the shower to wash off his stress, I went to work. My first call was to my personal lawyer, a shark of a woman named Sarah who had handled my grandmother's estate. I explained exactly what I needed. "I need a document that looks identical to a standard power of attorney from a distance," I told her, keeping my voice low. "But the fine print needs to be different. Instead of granting him rights to my assets, I want it to be a binding assumption of debt and a spousal waiver of claims to the marital home." "You want him to unknowingly sign a document stating he takes on all liability and walks away with nothing?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Morgan, that is diabolical. I will have it messengered to you by noon tomorrow." My second call was to the private investigator I had hired earlier that afternoon while sitting in my car. He had already sent a preliminary report to my secure email. I opened the file on my phone, and the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Sloane was not just a bored housewife looking for a thrill. She was desperate. The report showed that she was a regular at an underground poker ring in North Chicago. She was in the hole for nearly $250,000. The loan sharks were circling, and Richard had no idea. She did not love Grant. She needed a mule to carry her debt. She was pressuring Grant to liquidate my apartment not for a romantic getaway, but to save her own legs from being broken. I closed the phone and rubbed my belly. "Do not worry," I whispered to the baby. Daddy thinks he is a wolf, but he is just a sheep walking into a slaughterhouse. I arranged to meet Richard at a small, dimly lit coffee shop 3 blocks away from the financial district, a place known more for its privacy than its espresso. I arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a booth in the far back corner where the shadows were deep enough to hide a conspiracy. When Richard walked in, he commanded the room even without trying. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first car, with silver hair and eyes that scanned the room with the precision of a hawk. He sat down opposite me, placing his leather briefcase on the seat beside him. He did not order a drink. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice polite but guarded. "I must admit, I was surprised by your call. Grant usually handles our project updates." "I assume this is about the liquidity issue he mentioned." I looked at him, feeling a strange pang of sympathy. He was a titan of industry, yet he was just as blind as I had been. I decided not to sugarcoat the poison pill I was about to feed him. "This is not about the project, Richard," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "And I am not here as Grant's wife. I am here as a fellow victim." I reached into my bag and pulled out the tablet. I placed it on the table between us and pressed play on the audio file I had recorded at the Aveline Hotel. The sound of Sloane's voice, husky and mocking, filled the small space between us. "He is so old, Grant. I cannot stand him touching me anymore. Once we get her money, we are gone." Richard went perfectly still. He did not blink. He did not breathe. He just stared at the device as if it were a bomb counting down. I swiped to the next image, the photo of Grant and Sloane kissing in the car, followed by the screenshots of their texts detailing the plan to bankrupt us both. "My husband is sleeping with your wife," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "And they are planning to use the equity in my apartment to fund their escape from both of us." Richard looked up. The politeness was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying rage. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. "That explains the withdrawals," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "I noticed some irregularities in our joint accounts last week. $200,000 moved to a holding company I did not recognize. She told me it was for inventory for her boutique." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Inventory. She was funding her exit strategy. "I am not going to let them win." "Richard," I said, leaning forward, "I do not want just a divorce. I want justice." "Grant thinks he is going to walk away with a fortune tonight. I have a plan to make sure he walks away with nothing but debt and shame. But I need your help." I outlined the plan for the dinner party. I explained the bait and switch with the legal documents, the way I intended to trap Grant into signing away his life while thinking he was stealing mine. I watched Richard carefully, waiting for him to balk, to say it was too cruel. Instead, he leaned back and nodded slowly. "You are more dangerous than your husband gives you credit for. Morgan." "He thinks I am just a pregnant housewife," I replied. Richard's expression shifted, a flicker of pain crossing his eyes. He looked down at his hands. "Speaking of pregnancy, there is something you should know. Sloane told me 2 days ago that she is expecting. She swore it was mine." My breath caught in my throat. "And is it mathematically impossible?" Richard said, his voice like grinding stones. "She claims she is 8 weeks along. 8 weeks ago, I was in Tokyo for a month-long merger negotiation. I was not even on the same continent." The silence that followed was heavy with our shared humiliation. Grant and Sloane had played us for fools, mocking our trust and our love. But they had made a fatal error. They had pushed us into the same corner. "So," Richard said, straightening his cuffs, his demeanor shifting back to that of the ruthless businessman. "Tonight is not a dinner party. It is a trial." "And we are the executioners," I added. "I will be there at 7 o'clock sharp." Richard promised as he stood up. "And Morgan, do not let him see you bleed until we cut him." I drove home feeling a strange sense of calm. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold, hard steel of resolve. I was no longer fighting this war alone. I had an army, and tonight, the enemy was coming to dinner. The atmosphere in the penthouse that evening was brittle, like glass waiting to be shattered. I had spent the afternoon arranging the space not as a home, but as a theater. I filled the vases with white lilies, flowers that Grant thought were romantic, but which I had always associated with funerals. The air conditioning was set 2 degrees lower than usual, creating a chill that required a sweater, keeping everyone on edge and unable to relax. Grant was pacing the living room floor, wearing a path into the Persian rug. Every 30 seconds, his hand would dive into his pocket to check his phone, and I knew he was sending frantic updates to Sloane. Between texts, he would walk over to the sidebar where the manila folder lay, lifting the cover just to make sure the forged documents were still there, still waiting for my signature to turn his fantasy into reality. He looked like a man standing on a ledge, terrified of the fall but desperate for the flight. I emerged from the bedroom at exactly 7 o'clock. I had chosen a midnight blue silk maternity gown that draped over my 7-month bump like water. I had pinned my hair back severely, exposing my face and neck, leaving myself nowhere to hide. I applied my lipstick with the precision of war paint. When I walked into the living room, Grant stopped pacing and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You look beautiful, Morgan," he said, his voice tight. "Are you ready to get this over with?" "Let's wait for our guests," I replied calmly, smoothing the silk over my stomach. "We cannot start the celebration without witnesses." The doorbell rang at 7:15. Grant jumped as if he had been electrocuted. He rushed to answer it, and a moment later, Sloane and Richard walked into our lives. Sloane was a vision of calculated seduction. She wore a tight crimson dress that left little to the imagination, a stark contrast to the elegant restraint of my home. She held onto Richard's arm, but her eyes immediately locked onto Grant, flashing a message of conspiracy and hunger. She stepped forward to hug me, and I smelled the same cloying perfume that had been on Grant's shirt the day before. "Morgan, it is so lovely to finally meet the woman behind the man," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The pleasure is all mine, Sloane," I said, smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. "Grant talks about you constantly. He says you are indispensable." Richard stood behind her, playing his part perfectly. He shook Grant's hand with a firm, bone-crushing grip, acting the role of the busy, slightly impatient investor. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the cold, sharp steel of a blade ready to drop. We exchanged a microscopic nod. The trial had begun. We moved to the seating area, and I played the gracious hostess. "Champagne for everyone to celebrate the new venture?" I asked, lifting a chilled bottle. "Please," Grant said, holding out his glass a little too eagerly. "I will have a glass," Richard said smoothly. I turned to Sloane. "And for you?" Sloane. "A toast to the future." Sloane hesitated, her hand fluttering nervously to her stomach in a protective, instinctive gesture. I recognized it immediately because I had been doing it myself for the last 7 months. It was the unconscious movement of a mother shielding her unborn child. "Oh, no thank you," she said quickly, her face paling slightly under her heavy makeup. "I am on a detox. Just water for me." I poured the water, my eyes locking on hers. "That is very responsible of you. It is amazing the sacrifices we make for our bodies, isn't it? My mother always said that once you bring a new life into the world, or even prepare to, you have to give up your old selfish ways. You have to be loyal to something bigger than yourself." Sloane choked on her first sip of water. Grant looked at me, confused by the sudden philosophical turn. "Well, loyalty is key in business too," Grant stammered, trying to steer the conversation back to safe ground. That is why we are all here. To secure the future. Exactly, I said, sitting down and resting my hands on my belly. Honesty and loyalty. Without them, you are just building a house on sand. Do you agree? Sloane. Sloane looked like she was going to be sick. She shifted in her seat, avoiding Richard's gaze. Yes, of course. Grant could not take the tension anymore. He stood up abruptly, his patience snapping. He needed the money, and he needed it now. He walked to the sidebar and grabbed the folder, bringing it to the coffee table with a forced air of authority. Well, speaking of the future, let's get the boring part out of the way so we can enjoy dinner, Grant said, uncapping a heavy fountain pen. He slid the documents toward me, his hand trembling slightly. It is just standard formalities. Babe. Sign here, and we can open that second bottle of champagne. I looked at the papers, then at him, then at Sloane. The trap was set. All I had to do was spring it. I picked up the heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen Grant had placed in front of me. It felt cold and weighty in my hand, like a weapon. The nib hovered over the signature line of the document that would supposedly authorize the restructuring of our assets, but would actually initiate the destruction of my husband's life. I could feel the tension in the room vibrating against my skin. Sloane was leaning forward slightly in her chair, her eyes fixed on the tip of the pen with a hunger she could not disguise. She was mentally spending my money before the ink was even dry, calculating how fast she could clear her gambling debts. Grant was holding his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the stem of his wine glass. I lowered the pen until it touched the paper, letting a tiny dot of ink bleed into the fiber. Then I stopped. I lifted the pen and let it clatter loudly onto the glass coffee table. The sound was sharp, piercing the silence like a gunshot. Wait, I said, turning my gaze directly to Sloane. Before I sign this and give you exactly what you want, there is one small detail we should clear up. Sloane, are you going to tell Richard about the baby in your belly? Or should I? The reaction was instantaneous. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Grant's hand went slack from shock, and his crystal champagne flute slipped through his fingers. It smashed against the hardwood floor, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards and sending a spray of pale yellow liquid across his expensive shoes. But he did not move. He did not look down. He was staring at me, his face a mask of total confusion. Sloane turned the color of ash. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out at first. She looked terrified, like a cornered animal realizing the trap had shut. I do not know what you are talking about, she stammered, her voice high and thin. That is ridiculous. I am not— Enough. Richard cut in. His voice was low, rolling through the room like thunder. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on his wife. The game is over, Sloane. The question is not whether you are pregnant. The question is, which lie are you sticking to tonight? Is it the baby you told me was mine 2 days ago to stop me from asking about the missing money? Or is it the baby you told Grant was his, so he would feel obligated to sell his wife's home? Grant whipped his head around to stare at Sloane, his eyes wide with horror. The blood had drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and gray. You told him it was his— Grant whispered, his voice trembling. You are pregnant. You never told me you were pregnant. You said you needed the money for us, for the business. You said we were building a future. Sloane looked between the three of us. Cornered. The facade of the sophisticated businesswoman crumbled. She burst into ugly, heaving sobs. She screamed. I need the money. The sharks are going to kill me if I do not pay them by next week. I do not know whose baby it is. It could be anyone's. I just needed a way out. The confession hung in the air, ugly and raw. Grant stared at her. The woman he had been ready to destroy his marriage for. He realized in that second that he was not her knight in shining armor. He was just a mark, a fool she had played to pay off her gambling debts. I saw the light go out in his eyes as his entire reality collapsed. He looked at me, his expression shifting to one of pleading, as if he suddenly remembered I was the only person in the room who had ever actually loved him, but I was not there to save him. I was there to bury him. "Do not look at me like you are the victim, Grant," I said, my voice cutting through his pity party. "You are just as rotten as she is." I reached under the coffee table and pulled out the manila envelope I had prepared. I tossed it onto the table, right on top of the forged loan documents. The photos splayed out like a fan grainy images of Grant and Sloane kissing in his car. Screenshots of their text messages where he called me a hormonal cow, and their detailed plans to flee the country with my money. "Look at them," I commanded. "You two are a perfect match. You are both liars who would sell your souls for a quick buck. You deserve each other." Grant was still on his knees, paralyzed by the weight of the financial devastation. He looked from the damning photographs to Sloane's sobbing form, and finally back to me. He did the only thing a coward knows how to do when his world collapses. He fell to his knees. He actually crawled the few feet across the Persian rug to where I was sitting, reaching for my hand. I pulled it away before he could touch me, repulsed by his desperation. "Morgan, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face in a performance that was insulting to watch. It was just a moment of weakness. She manipulated me. You heard her. I never stopped loving you. I was just confused. Please, baby, do not throw us away. We can fix this." "I can fix it," he cried, gesturing frantically to the papers on the table. "I will make it right. Just sign the papers, and I will use the money to pay off her debts, get her out of our lives, and we can start fresh. I swear." He was still trying to get the money, even while begging for his marriage. His greed was the loudest thing in the room. I smiled, a sharp, icy expression that should have warned him. "You want me to sign?" I asked softly. "You want to settle everything tonight?" "Yes, please, Morgan. Just sign, and we can move on." "Fine," I said, picking up the heavy pen again. "I always keep my word. Grant. I said I would sign a document tonight to secure our future, and I will." I pulled the folder closer. While they were screaming at each other, I had deftly slid the original fraudulent papers aside and replaced them with the document Sarah, my lawyer, had couriered over that morning. Grant was too panicked to notice the slight difference in the letterhead. I signed my name with a flourish at the bottom of the page, the scratch of the nib loud in the sudden silence. "There," I said, capping the pen. "It is done." Grant lunged for the papers, his face lighting up with relief. "Thank you. Morgan, you will not regret this. I promise. I will." "Give me that," Richard barked, snatching the document from Grant's trembling hands before he could even look at it. Richard adjusted his glasses and read the title of the document aloud, his voice booming like a judge passing sentence. "Personal Acknowledgement of Embezzlement and Voluntary Asset Forfeiture Agreement." Grant froze. "What? No, that is the power of attorney. That is the mortgage authorization." "No, Grant," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms over my chest. "It is not. You really should have read the fine print before you started begging. That document you just so eagerly watched me sign, it acts as a witness statement. It acknowledges that you accept full personal liability for the $250,000 missing from the Stratton and Oak accounts." I pointed to a stack of bank records Richard had placed on the sidebar earlier. "Richard provided the proof of your embezzlement. By witnessing that document, you just admitted to the theft and agreed to liquidate all your personal assets to repay the company." "My personal assets!" Grant stammered, his eyes darting around the room. "But the condo, the mortgage, the money from the house covers that." "That is the funny thing about the condo," I said, taking a sip of water. "You cannot mortgage a property you do not have a claim to. And technically, neither do I anymore." I pulled a single, crisp sheet of paper from my purse and held it up. 2 days ago. I transferred the title of this penthouse into an irrevocable trust for our son. It is locked down tight. Your signature on that bank loan application, since the property is not in my name personally anymore, and you forged my consent anyway. That application is now hard evidence of attempted bank fraud. Grant's mouth fell open. He looked from the document in Richard's hand to the trust deed in mine. He realized the math. So, let me clarify your position. I continued, my voice dangerously calm. You have zero access to the equity in this home. You have just confessed to stealing $250,000 from your boss. And you have committed federal wire fraud by trying to mortgage a property owned by a trust. You do not have a fortune. Grant, you do not even have a job. Grant slumped back onto his heels, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He looked at his hands, then at the luxury apartment he had tried to steal, realizing that he had just signed his own confession while thinking he was winning the lottery. Grant slumped back onto his heels, his pleas for mercy dead on his lips as he grasped the scope of his ruin. Richard moved first. He rose to his full height, his posture formal and unyielding, radiating an icy authority. This negotiation is concluded, Richard said, his voice quiet but carrying the finality of a gavel slam. He looked down at Grant. Grant, as of 7:35 p.m. this evening, you are terminated from Stratton and Oak, effective immediately. Furthermore, given the signed acknowledgement of debt and the evidence of fraud, my firm will be filing a police report and a civil suit first thing tomorrow morning for embezzlement and wire fraud. Your career in Chicago is over. Grant started to speak, a strangled, guttural sound of protest, but Richard ignored him. He turned to Sloane, who was still wiping mascara tracks down her cheeks. He pulled a crisp, legal-sized envelope from his inner jacket pocket and placed it gently on the coffee table beside the shattered champagne glass. And for you, my dear, Richard said, his tone utterly devoid of warmth. That contains 2 things: a signed petition for divorce and a temporary restraining order. Do not attempt to contact me or enter any property owned by the firm. As for the matter of support, I have already informed my legal team that I will require a full DNA test on the child you claim to be carrying. If the results indicate the baby is not mine, you will receive precisely 0 financial settlement. Your prenuptial agreement ensures that. Sloane shrieked, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that finally broke the stunned silence in the room. She snatched the envelope, tearing it open, her tears instantly replaced by raw, furious venom. You bastard, I did all of this for us, she wailed, immediately spinning on Grant, her finger pointed like a dagger. This is your fault. Grant, you were supposed to be the rich one. You promised me a new life. You should have just stayed married to your idiot wife. Grant stumbled back from her, finally seeing his co-conspirator for the monster she was. Me. You were the one who convinced me to forge the papers. You manipulated me. You lied about the baby. You are the one who owes money to loan sharks. The 2 lovers, who had been planning to run off into the sunset together, were now screaming accusations at each other in my living room, their dark secret exposed and turning them into enemies. Grant, seeing his accomplice turn into an active threat, looked desperately back at me, playing his last, pathetic card. He scrambled back to my feet. Morgan, you cannot let this happen. Think of the baby, our son. You cannot let his father go to jail. I stood up slowly. The silk of my gown rustled softly, and I placed both hands firmly on my 7-month belly. The height difference was sudden and intimidating. I looked down at the pathetic figure of the man who had been my husband. The contempt I felt was absolute. You have no claim to this child, Grant, I said, my voice cold, calm, and utterly final. This child is mine. I own this home, I own my future, and I own his name. As for you, Grant, You are just a mistake in my past that I just permanently erased. I looked toward the front door and gave a sharp, brief nod. Within seconds, two burly men in dark suits, the building's internal security team, whom I had prearranged, were standing in the archway. Escort Mr. Sterling and Ms. Thorne from the premises, I instructed them, not taking my eyes off Grant. They are no longer welcome here. And please ensure they do not take any personal belongings beyond the clothes they are wearing. Grant stared up at me, his face a grotesque mask of betrayal and fear. He opened his mouth to protest, but the security guards were already moving in, their movements efficient and unavoidable. As the guards moved toward him, he lunged, grabbing my ankle, his grip surprisingly strong. "Morgan, please, I am sorry. Do not do this," he shrieked, his face streaked with tears and snot. The guard pulled him away, but Grant was fighting. He looked at me, pure panic in his eyes. "You cannot throw me out. Where am I going to go? Richard has locked all the cards. I have zero cash. The bank is going to arrest me at 8 Sloane, seeing Richard walk straight out the door without a backward glance, decided Grant was her only desperate chance. She lunged toward him, sobbing. "Wait, Grant, take me with you. We can figure it out." Grant, however, was past reason. He violently shoved her away. "Get off me, you gold-digging witch! This is all your fault!" Sloane stumbled backward, hitting the wall with a painful thud, and the two former lovers started screaming obscenities at each other right there in the marble foyer of the 53rd floor. I stood at the door, watching the spectacle with zero emotion, a silent, powerful observer. The security guards were forced to separate them and began dragging Grant toward the service elevator. He looked back at me one last time, his mouth open in a soundless plea. I stepped forward, my voice clear and cutting through the chaos. "You wanted this condo, didn't you? Grant, you wanted my life, my stability, and my fortune. Well, congratulations." I stood tall, placing my hands on my hips. "Now you have no home, no job, no honor, and zero legal recourse. Good luck with your new life." I did not wait for his reply. I simply reached out and slammed the heavy oak door shut. The sound was deafening, a sharp, decisive thud that echoed through the quiet apartment, the finality of a judge's gavel closing the court on his case. I leaned my head against the cool wood, listening to the muffled, pathetic screams and shuffling fading down the hall. Then, it was quiet, completely, profoundly quiet. I walked back into the living room, ignoring the shattered glass on the floor and the discarded paperwork. The lights of Chicago at night, millions of tiny, defiant stars sparkled through the massive windows. I walked to the counter, poured myself a glass of warm milk, and settled back onto the sofa. I looked down at my swollen belly, gently caressing the hard curve where my son rested. There were no tears now, not even a tremble, just a quiet, deep sense of resolution. I smiled. "Just us two. Little one," I whispered to the baby. "And everything that matters belongs only to us." I finished the milk, set the glass down, and reached for the remote. I pressed the power button, plunging the vast, opulent living room into darkness. The only light now came from the distant, indifferent city, casting long, peaceful shadows over the room, leaving the past firmly outside. Thank you for listening to my story. Please comment below to share where you are tuning in from. Subscribe to Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit the hype button to make sure this story is heard by more people.